Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. Welcome to my Editing Images in Lightroom CC Editing Guide. Now this is for photographers wanting to edit primarily on their mobile devices, smartphones and tablets. Now it is possible to install Lightroom CC on laptops and desktop computers as well. Now this is a different product to Lightroom Classic. So if you're a Classic user, I do have a separate tutorial movie for that product. Now one of the advantages of CC is its cloud syncing across all devices. We don't really have to worry where we're storing our images, and once we've edited an image on one device, it appears edited on all of our devices. Now one of the ways that Adobe manages this Lightroom CC version is a variation of working with original files and something called Smart Previews. These are low resolution versions of the full resolution file. We can at any time download that full resolution to our mobile device if it is not already there. If any time in the future your storage capacity is slightly compromised, then Lightroom CC may decide to remove the originals from your device and just leave them in the cloud storage, but we always have access to our original files. You can actually use Lightroom CC on a mobile device without paying a subscription fee, but if you are a member you do get that 1 terabyte worth of cloud storage. If you go to the full cloud storage option, you're able to sync presets and profiles. You have some localized editing adjustments such as the healing brush, and also selective adjustments like radial filters, graduated filters, and we also have what's called Sensei Search. This is the ability to search our images looking for specific images even though we may not have added keywords to those images. Now this is basically using artificial intelligence or machine learning to recognize certain things. So for instance, we can search for dogs just by the fact that the software will recognize what a dog looks like and then just show us the images that are just the dogs in our catalog. So one of the things that if you are taking your mobile device out on the road with your cameras and you're wanting to add images to that mobile device, maybe you're using a 64 gigabyte SD card, you are going to have to be careful not to exceed the storage capacity of your mobile device, and also compromise the data transfer. Now some of you may be on data transfer limits and some of you might have slow cellular communications. So one of the things I do recommend is once you're on the road and you don't have Wi-Fi access, switch off the cloud storage both on the device, such as you might be using Google Photos or Dropbox or iCloud Photos. Switch all of that off, and also switch off the option for using cellular data in the Lightroom CC app. Otherwise you're going to be chewing through your data limits very, very quickly. One of the things that if you're out on the road, you're going to be wanting to add images directly from your memory cards to your mobile device. So this may not be possible to hook the camera directly up to your mobile device, so you might need to check that. I'm currently using an SD card reader to my iPad Pro. Now iPad Pros have just recently upgraded to USB-C ports, and my very latest Sony camera does actually have a USB-C port, so it may be possible to hook the camera directly up to the mobile device. And you can actually now bypass maybe something like iPhotos and take the images directly into Lightroom. Now one of the advantages of editing and editing images on the road is just minutes after capturing an image we can share an image. So I might have taken a picture of somebody playing tennis or somebody's dog running, and within minutes I can share that image, an edited version of that image, so that they can have quick access to that file. It is also possible to add images on Lightroom CC on your laptop or desktop computer, and those images will eventually appear on your mobile device when that mobile device is synced. Now one of the advantages of doing this is you you're going to be able to access and edit your images. Maybe you're on a long distance flight and you can start editing the images. What I do strongly recommend, however, is syncing your Lightroom catalog before leaving home, syncing via a fast Wi-Fi connection. Otherwise it is going to take a little bit of time to sync all of those raw files, hundreds and hundreds of raw files you may have added via, again, cellular data. Okay, before we go into the editing, I just want to do a little bit of basically my personal feelings towards editing images. Some people have mixed feelings towards why and when we should edit images. Now, I strongly believe that cameras do not see what we see, and they cannot record what we feel. And that's because cameras are merely mechanical devices without a soul. Cameras can collect information, but their images do not communicate our memories and feelings without first being edited. So the unprocessed image file is the equivalent, say, to the composer's score, while editing that image is the performance. This is where we put our heart and soul and what we actually want to say about what we've captured. Now, this was adapted from an Ansel Adams quote, and he was talking about going out and shooting images on film, and basically that was his composer's score, if you like, but the performance happened in the darkroom. Now these days we're using Lightroom. Okay, editing images in Lightroom allows us to express our vision and tell our story. Some photographers you'll see online like to use an acronym SOOC, straight out of camera. Some photographers wear this as a badge, as if to say, look, I haven't cheated. But I also feel that that is also a way of declaring, look, I have had no personal response to the subject matter I've been capturing. I'm just letting my camera, the mechanical camera, just tell you what it captured. I'm not going to interject and tell you how I feel about what I captured. Okay, to give you some hard concrete examples of this, this is an image of my local pier at sunset. Now, generally these sunset shots are not what we remember seeing. Cameras record sunsets completely different to how humans see sunsets. So if I was to post this online, I possibly would get very, very few likes. This is the straight out of camera view. Cameras generally don't deal with contrast very well, but just with a small amount of editing, maybe a graduated or linear filter, I can add what I actually experienced at sunset at my local pier. And this is, for me, a more accurate way of communicating what I saw and also what I felt about what I saw. To give you another extreme example, I captured this in Monument Valley in USA. It's at sunrise, and the foreground is almost a complete silhouette. I couldn't have raised the exposure in camera anymore, otherwise I would have overexposed the sky. So the foreground becomes a near silhouette, but this is not what I remember seeing. I would have seen rich detail in those foreground shadows, and so again, with a little bit of editing, raising the shadows, bringing down the highlights, this is how I can tell you what I saw when I captured this image. Now, sometimes the differences that I'm editing can be quite subtle. This is a cold, frosty morning in the UK in winter, and again, this is straight out of camera. It's not a million miles from what I saw, but if I want to communicate how absolutely freezing cold this situation was, is again a little bit of editing shows that white, crisp frost in all of its glory, and this is much closer to what I felt about what I photographed. Now, cameras, as I said, are compromised in what they can capture, especially with high contrast scenes, but also lenses distort what they see compared to the human vision. For instance, these verticals on these beach huts seem to be falling inwards. This is a lens effect from using an ultra wide angle lens where the camera is tilted up slightly. The verticals will lean in very aggressively, and in post-production we can correct those verticals to represent what we would have saw with the human eyes. So see Lightroom less as an instrument for cheating, more as a way of telling the truth, telling your story, being honest about what it is we captured and how we felt about what we captured. I call this expressive editing. It's learning how to say what you want to say, and with a little bit of practice you can edit your images in just a minute or two to be faithful to your memories. Here is another example of straight out of camera. You can see all of the sliders there in Lightroom CC. They're all zeroed out. So this is basically what the camera captured. Now, who is to say whether this is correct? You weren't there, I was there, and I might choose to edit this in a completely different way. For instance, who's to say that it doesn't communicate more accurately about how I felt about what I saw? Or maybe a different photographer would prefer to communicate a little bit more warmth in this situation. Or maybe a black and white dramatic shot, because we were knocked over by how dramatic the light and shade was as it sculpted these sand dunes in Western Australia. So who's to say which is correct? Now, for some people, they do actually want to edit just to actually alter reality, just so they can gain what's called a signature style. It's a way of finding a unique voice, so that when people see your images, they'll go, oh, that reminds me of the images captured by, and if you're lucky, they'll mention your name, because the style of the way you edit is basically part of how you communicate as a photographer. Without much further ado, let's jump into editing images in Lightroom CC. Now, I have heard on some forums, some self-appointed Lightroom experts will say the software engineers arrange these in a particular order that you should go in when you're editing your images. Now, I've been a beta tester for 2 decades or so, and this is exactly not what the Lightroom engineers envisaged. Lightroom engineers describe Lightroom as a non-linear editing program. It really doesn't matter what editing slider you touch first, and what I always like to advise is start by editing what you notice first, and then finish up with editing the things that are annoying you least. And then when you're happy that you've managed to communicate what it is you want to say, the editing is complete. Okay, so as I said, just to recap there, start with fixing what annoys you the most and finish with what annoys you the least. So let's start to edit. The first thing you're going to do is, when you're in the grid view, you're just going to tap on one of the images, and that will take you straight into the edit module or panel. Now, we have a series of collapsed panels there, and we can just tap on any of those panels to open them up to start the editing process. Now, another thing that you can do before you start to edit is you can get information about your image. You can basically do a 2-finger tap on the screen, and you can cycle through basically when the image was captured, the camera settings used to capture that image, and you can also cycle through to what is called a histogram. This is a graphical representation of tone, and some photographers find this useful when editing images. It's a bit like having a rear view mirror in a car. It's something you can glance at or refer to occasionally to get a little bit more information about how the editing is going, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through this tutorial. You can also access that just by tapping once in the top right hand corner, tapping once again on view options, and you can either show hide info or show hide histogram. You've also got an option for what's called film strip. I know you're probably not using film, but that's what the Lightroom engineers like to call little thumbnails that appear on the bottom of the screen, so you can jump between images that you're editing without going back to that grid view. I prefer to maximize the screen real estate, so typically I'll have that collapsed and only open that up when I'm moving on to the next image. So I've opened up the light panel there. Now you feel free to move those sliders around. Don't be afraid of moving them very aggressively. Move them all the way to the end of the slider if you like. You cannot do any damage to your image. You can always revert back to the original state of the image. Basically, Lightroom CC is a non-destructive editing program. You will never permanently adjust your image. Lightroom always keeps the original in its unedited state, and all of the Lightroom edits are just applied on the fly, so you can see that on the screen. If you do hold down one finger onto the screen, you can actually go and look at a before and after view, so you can basically track your progress through the editing procedure. Now, most of the edits you're going to be doing is you're just going to be putting a single finger on a slider and moving that slider left or right. Now, there are a couple of variations to the way we edit. We can pinch zoom the image, basically just magnify the size of the image slightly, and now when we touch one of the sliders and move left or right, all of those panels on the right hand side will auto collapse, so we can see basically the image in its enlarged magnified view without the panels getting in the way. Basically the adjustment slider that we're moving will stay visible on the screen, but all of the other panels and sliders will disappear from view momentarily. Another thing that we can do is, again, we will basically be using mostly single finger slides and taps on the screen, but there are 4 or more sliders where we can actually put 2 fingers on the screen and slide 2 fingers when moving an adjustment slider. Now in the light panel, this is the blacks, whites, highlights and shadow slider, and we can get what's called a threshold view when we do that, to see where on the screen or what parts of the image we're losing information. So in the top right hand corner of this preview that I'm showing you here, we have the original image, and as I'm sliding the black slider to the left, any areas that appear black on the screen, it's going absolute black. We're losing all texture and detail in those areas, so usually this is an indication to move the slider back the other way, not be quite so aggressive with the adjustment on this particular slider. Now when we're editing an image, you may be looking at the image going, the quality doesn't look great, and it's to do with maybe the screen preview. We can see almost like pixelation or tonal banding, not smooth transitions of tone and or color. Now when this happens, it's most likely that the original file is in Adobe's Creative Cloud, and you actually got just a smart preview on your mobile device. This will often happen when we've added images via a laptop or desktop computer using Lightroom CC on those devices, and typically the original file isn't downloaded to the mobile device unless we specifically ask Lightroom to do that. So if you do notice that you've got some stepping or banding of tone, just go up to your little cloud icon and choose Get This Original, and you'll notice the quality of the preview jumps up as soon as that original file is downloaded to your device. You can, for instance, also choose to store all images in an album that you've created and store all of those images locally on your mobile device, so long as you have enough storage space on that device. Now another thing that you should be aware of when using smart previews is we can happily just edit the image using that smart preview, and occasionally you won't see any drop in quality or whatever, but when you're going to export the image and you're wanting a big 4K export that can be viewed on your 4K TV or to share very high resolution with a social media site such as Flickr or 500px, you don't have to worry about the fact that you're working with that lower resolution Smart Preview, because as soon as you try and export a much higher resolution image, Lightroom will automatically download the full resolution version, apply your editing workflow on that full resolution, and then export that ultra high definition version to your files or to social media. Let's talk a little bit about profiles and presets. Now, there, right just below the edit, we do have a tab called Profile. Now, by default, the starting profile is a profile called Adobe Color. Now, most people will be more than happy to start every image edit with Adobe Color, but there is a choice. If you feel that your image is capturing images slightly low contrast or slightly cool, you can choose a different starting point. So you don't have to apply those edits, you can just apply basically a different starting template. Now, Lightroom will give you many templates to choose from. You can maybe choose Adobe Portrait or Adobe Vivid or Adobe Landscape, etc., and use that as an initial starting point. You also have some camera matching profiles. These will try and match options that might be available in your specific camera, so you can try looking at those as well. One of the other things you can choose to do is just go browsing through some creative filters or some monochrome profiles to find an alternative starting point. I often use, for instance, a different profile when I'm starting to edit a black and white image. And you'll notice at the bottom of the screen there's a little slider. Once we've applied the profile, we can increase or decrease the effects of that profile on the starting point of that image. I should go back one slide and just say that we can also tap in the top right hand corner of one of those profiles and add it to your favorites. If it's a profile that you use regularly, you can simply just add it to your favorites. One of the things that you can also do is, if you don't have enough profiles or presets on your mobile device, you can also add additional profiles and presets. For instance, a lot of Lightroom users will often purchase or acquire via free downloads presets online. Now, there isn't currently a way of adding them to your mobile device, but if you add them to your desktop version of Lightroom CC, then they will appear in your mobile versions. We can also, for instance, create custom profiles. For instance, I often make a custom profile for my specific camera. So instead of using Adobe Color or a Sony neutral profile, I might refer to my custom camera profile that I've created using this color management piece of hardware and software. This one's called an X-Rite Color Checker. You can then add those in Lightroom CC on your desktop, and basically they will appear in your mobile version. The presets icon is two overlapping circles just there on the upper right hand corner. Now, presets is basically a one-click edit. If you tap on a name preset, you can apply multiple adjustments at the same time to one or more images. It's basically a recipe of adjustments put together that might look good on one of your images. It's always a little bit of a hit and miss affair when using presets, but certainly it's not very time consuming just to tap on a few presets to find if you can find a good one. It's a bit like using filters in, say, Instagram or whatever. Now, you can create your own presets once you've got some specific adjustments you like applying on more than one image. You can create your own preset and then put them in the user presets folder, or you can actually create additional folders of presets. So for instance, you might have some color grading presets that you want to apply just with a single tap, rather than having to move a bunch of sliders each and every time you edit an image. Now, one of the things that I do recommend when creating a preset is not to apply all of the settings that you've been using on a specific image. Generally, that is a way of not being able to transfer over those settings to another image. For instance, settings like exposure and white balance are specific to a single image, whereas maybe a split toning or a vignette might be something that you'll want to apply in the same way to multiple images. So think carefully about what adjustments you add to your presets. Okay, so here I created a split tone preset, and now I'm applying it to a different image in my library just by tapping on that little thumbnail. I do have free presets on my website, www.markgaylor.com. They're free to download, and just remember you add them to Lightroom CC on your desktop, and then they will appear on your mobile versions as well. Okay, let's start going through some of the panels. We'll start off with the light panel. I could start off with color instead, but let's just start off with the light panel. Just remember, no specific order here. Now, before I get into making some of the adjustments in the light panel, just remember we do have the ability to view histograms on our camera as well. And one of my strong recommendations is try to get the image as correctly exposed as you can in camera before making minor adjustments in our post-production software. Certainly beware of massive overexposure or underexposure, because if we overexpose some highlight tones, there is nothing to say we can recover or restore information in those tones in post-production. They may be sufficiently overexposed to record with no usable data in those areas of the image. So basically just remember, try to get the exposure correct in camera. For instance, this image that had predominantly dark tones does lead the camera to slightly overexpose in those instances. So I've allowed for that by underexposing by 1 stop on my exposure compensation dial in camera. Now I'm referring to the histogram in the camera, and again I'm using that almost like a rear vision mirror just to keep an eye on what's happening in the camera. And here I am showing you what will happen with the histogram when we've got information in front of the camera that is actually overexposed. You'll see the histogram hits the right hand edge and starts to climb up that wall, and that is a clear warning that those tones are overexposed and may not be able to be recovered in post-production software such as Lightroom CC. On some cameras you might be able to switch on the blinkies when reviewing the image to see whether you did overexpose those tones. This gives you often the opportunity to make another exposure with a slightly reduced exposure. I'm reviewing the information on the back of the camera to see whether another exposure is necessary before taking those images into my Lightroom catalog. Now, some people may need to look at separate tutorials about how we refer to histograms. Just a short track this is don't worry about the shape of the mountains or the hills in the middle of the histogram. The thing to worry about is what is on the extreme left and what is on the extreme right. This is where the underexposure and overexposure warnings live. So try and get all of the information in the capture in between those goalposts. Now, just to explain that histogram in a little bit more detail, we have the blacks on the extreme left, then come the shadows, in the middle is the midtones, which are controlled by the exposure slider in Lightroom, then we have the highlights, and we have a dedicated highlight slider, and then on the extreme right we have the white slider. We have one more slider in the light panel called contrast, and this will push the highlights and shadows in separate directions or pull them closer together if we're lowering contrast. But the two mini histograms underneath that larger histogram there are the things to be aware of. Underexposure, the histogram climbing up that left-hand wall, or the histogram climbing up the right-hand wall, meaning overexposure. This is generally what you're looking at when you're editing your images. When you are exposing images in the camera, you're generally exposing for the highlights. Just remember, try and keep a little bit of information in those highlights, because we can always process the shadows in Lightroom very quickly and restore the information there. But if we've overcooked those highlights, we will not be able to restore information in Lightroom with there. Now there are a few highlights which we do allow to be overexposed as a general rule of thumb. These are called the specular highlights. These are often the light source itself appearing in the image or the reflection of the light source off a shiny surface. These will always overexpose. We shouldn't try and get information into those areas. So if you were to put 2 fingers on your trackpad and move the white slider to the right, you'd expect to see clipping, overexposure in those areas where the light globes are inside of that lamp. And in the opposite example here is if we have the absence of a surface such as a void, an open doorway where that is not a black doorway behind this guy, it's basically depth, it's space being unlit, we would also expect those to clip or underexpose. We're not trying to pull detail on an empty cavernous void. Now, one of the things that we can do when we're editing is simply just touch the auto button. Generally, if you've been shooting JPEGs in camera, there's a little bit of auto going on there as well. But if you're a RAW shooter, you might want to see what Lightroom would do if we just let Lightroom take its best guess at how to edit an image. Now, maybe 80% of the time it does a reasonable approach. I would typically argue that you can always do it better manually, but it's certainly worth just tapping. We can always click the undo button just on the top row there. Just do that little arrow button to go back one step if you didn't like what auto did to your image. In some instances, however, auto will create certain problems. For instance, in this particular image, there was no clear white bright tone, and Lightroom always assumes that there should be one in the image somewhere, someone wearing a white shirt or some aspect of white somewhere in the image. So it's assumed that the brightest tone in this image, which is the man's skin, should be rendered white. So this creates an unnatural highlight on the cheek of this Japanese guy standing in front of this open doorway. So if you did click auto, you would quickly proceed to that white slider and wind it back so we get a much more natural highlight on that skin. You can start with auto and then just modify a couple of the sliders that Lightroom has adjusted automatically. Now you might hear on some forums, some photographers might say, oh, don't bother with the sliders. All professional photographers use the tone curve. Now this is seriously out of date information. Yes, the tone curve was the most sophisticated adjustment tool in Photoshop, but time has moved on, and since we're now using these more sophisticated editing programs such as Lightroom, we're not using the tone curve, especially in programs like Lightroom. Now this is an example where I'm pulling down the highlights of this white t-shirt so we can see detail, and then restoring the shadows with another adjustment on that tone curve, and the midtones have fallen apart completely. We've pretty much nearly wrecked the appearance of those midtones by trying to do this editing process using a tone curve. And had we just stuck with the sliders, we could have simply just grabbed that highlight slider, which represents where the t-shirt is, and just pull that to the left to darken those tones. And it has no knock-on effect to the midtones or shadows. And tone curve generally does have a knock-on effect. Now in the full version of Photoshop, we can use very sophisticated time-consuming techniques called luminosity masking. They're very time-consuming, and there is no point in going down that editing task or workflow, because we can simply do this with a 1-second edit by putting our finger on that highlight slider and lowering their tonal value. Okay, so where to start? This will vary from image to image, but occasionally you'll capture an image that you start scratching your head going, I'm actually not too sure where I should start editing this image. Now, to show you this example captured at sunset on a beach in my home state of Victoria, the first thing I'll say is I can't see the shadow detail, it's too dark. I can't see the highlight detail, it's too bright. I can't make any color corrections because I can't see much of the color. So because the shadows and highlights are either too bright or too dark, let's start there. So I'm just going to grab those highlights and move them all of the way down and move all of the shadows. Now this isn't going to be the perfect edit, but at least I can see the information to start making other decisions. If I've decided I've pushed one of those sliders a little bit too far, I can come back a little bit. I would prefer to see people not nudging sliders 2, 3, 4, 5, but basically grab that slider, move it until it's too much, and then come back a little bit. That's a faster way of editing. And there is my final edit. Now you might think that's come an extraordinarily long way and probably took me 20 minutes to edit. It actually took me 1 minute, and I have a movie on my YouTube movie which shows me editing this image in 1 minute. It's a 1 minute movie. So once you've got control over Lightroom, some of these edits are exceptionally quick. One of the things that will happen when you're reviewing images once you've loaded them onto your mobile device is you might inadvertently skip past them thinking, oh, that's rubbish, I won't bother editing that, that hasn't worked out. And what I say to you is, if you took that image, that image deserves a closer inspection just by moving maybe the shadows or highlight slider to see what was lurking in those dark shadows. And certainly here is an example where I've moved that shadow slider to +100 just to see what was there, and this might encourage you, oh, that image isn't as bad as I thought it was. This image, does deserve a few minutes of my editing time to see whether I can get that image looking fabulous, which is why I took the image in the first place. And so I've titled this image "Let There Be Light." This was captured with a long exposure with the tripod on the ground, and we can see the blue light coming from this guy's mobile phone there. This is another image that I really enjoyed capturing, but the raw image doesn't do the scene justice at all. I've lowered the exposure a little bit to make sure I don't overexpose the highlights, but this has rendered those running dogs very, very dark. So again, I've exposed for the highlights, process for the shadows, and again you'll see the highlight slider has come down to -100, the shadows have gone up to +100. Typically we can get an unnaturally flat looking image when we do both of those sliders in extremes, so I would typically always encourage you to follow up with some contrast and maybe even a little bit clarity once you've moved two sliders in opposite directions very aggressively. This just restores the contrast to those mid-tones. Here I am again out on location shooting a portrait. It looks a little bit dark. Raw files often do look darker than we remember than seeing them on the camera. Any adjustments that might be applied to the previews on the camera are not applied to the previews in Lightroom, so it is typical for shadows to look significantly darker for raw shooters. But that's a simple case of just raising the exposure by one stop and raising the shadows a little bit, and we can quickly restore the tonality of this image to where it needs to be. Just looking up at the top histogram, you can see the histogram reaches out and touches the right hand side but doesn't climb the wall. It reaches out and just about touches the left hand side, but again doesn't climb up the left hand wall. And there is the finished edit of this indigenous guy at a demonstration in Melbourne. Again, exposing for the highlights. I want the plumage to look really good, but I don't want to do that at the expense of the water behind the bird. I do want a little bit of detail there, so I have lowered the exposure just a little bit in camera, just so that I don't overexpose those tones, and then I restore the shadow detail in post, +70 on those shadows and 1/3 of a stop raised in the exposure. Again, always making sure that I don't overexpose the brightest information, which does tend to lead to those shadows looking a little bit dark, but can be quickly restored in post. Another plus 60 shadows and another +1 stop on that exposure slider pretty much corrects this image. Again, exposing for the highlights, that white dress needs to be protected. Now, often I am raising the shadows so I can see information in the dark shadows. Ever so occasionally though, I make a different decision and say I actually don't want to see information in those shadows. In this particular instance, I want them to be quite dark and foreboding in this instance, so I'm actually going to push the shadow slider darker so we don't have any details visible in those dark shadows in this instance. And to give you another example of me editing, this is in Alaska. I wanted the background cliff behind this iceberg coming down the river to be very, very dark and ominous, so which really highlights that flying bird next to that big iceberg. So you don't have to follow a recipe to the letter every time. You can make creative decisions on an image to image basis. I did say you can't damage an image, and you can't damage an image by processing, but in some instances you can create image artifacts that don't look good. Typically they look like the image has been over processed. You're basically telling everybody to notice that Photoshop has or Lightroom has edited this image. Now a couple of the sliders that can do this if used very aggressively is the clarity slider. If we push that up to +100 in combination with pulling down the highlights and opening up the shadows, we can get these dark halos coming off the high contrast edges. Be aware of them, because once you're aware of them, you will notice other people will notice them on the forums, and they might be a bit polite and not mention them, but a lot of people will notice them. So you basically just have to be a little bit more conservative in these instances with those sliders. Just back up off the highlight slider or the clarity slider until that halo is much less noticeable. Let's come over to the color tab now. So we've basically looked at most of the sliders in that light tab. Now below the light tab we have the color tab. Now there is a little eyedropper tool. It's called the white balance selector. You can tap it with your finger and then move your finger into the image and select a tone that is neutral. And what I mean by neutral, it is a tone of grey. It doesn't actually have any color. This is a way of selecting a correct white balance in the image. I have to say it's very hit and miss unless you're working with a white balance reference card. So I typically do not use this tool unless I have a white balance reference card to actually click on. You might think you're able just to click on a white shirt or a grey shirt, but generally those tones will soak up a little bit of the neighboring color, and so you might click on them thinking it'll correct your image, but often the image will go very warm or very cool, just to show you that neutral tone which you perceive to be neutral is actually a little bit warm or cool and should be left that way. Most photographers are actually using auto white balance set in their cameras, and we do have auto white balance that can be set in Lightroom as well. Now if we've used auto white balance in the camera, the image will open up as shot. This means it's using the white balance reference that the camera has assigned to that file. Now auto white balance, whether it be used in Lightroom or whether it be used in the camera, is about as accurate as auto exposure, i.e. it's probably got a better than 50% success rate, but it's not successful all of the time. So you will want to override that auto white balance. And so I'm going to show you some images where I've done just that. So in this image I've lowered the temperature slider, the temp slider, moved it to the left to cool the image down. Now the temperature is given in degrees Kelvin. That's what the K stands for, thousands of degrees Kelvin, and I've lowered this to minus 600 degrees Kelvin, lower than the auto, and this significantly changed the color distribution in the image. I'll just go back so you can remember. Predominantly yellow, green, warm tones there. Now we're getting some cooler tones flooding those background tones. And what I've done here is, as well as coming to a white balance that is a lot more accurate than auto white balance guessed at, I'm also getting a complementary colors between the cooler tones and the warm tones, creating that nice composition of color. And I tend to look for this quite a lot when I'm editing, if possible and when appropriate. To give you an example, this is a picture of my daughter on a local pier at twilight, and again it's gone, the auto white balance has gone for predominantly warm tones. I think it's overcompensating for the large amounts of cool blue sky in the background, which is why this is overly warm in my instance. Now we can click on the auto and select a specific white balance from that list. We could move it from as shot to auto to see whether Lightroom does a better job. Typically auto and as shot are usually very similar, so in that instance that won't resolve this problem. So what I've done is, again, just manually dragging that temperature slider to the left, cool the image down. I've dragged it 700 degrees Kelvin lower than the auto, and again that creates these complementary colors. The blue sky, which is complementing the warm hues of that skin, and for me this is a much better color composition than the as shot. So you won't often know whether you can improve on the auto white balance until you physically drag these sliders. It's always worth 5 or 10 seconds of your time just to see whether the color white balance can improve your image. Again, another auto white balance in camera. This one's probably a lot closer to being accurate to the scene that I was photographing, but I've decided to be a little bit creative in this instance, and this time move the tint slider. This is the controls the green magenta balance below the yellow blue balance, and basically by pushing in a little bit more magenta, I've created those complementary colors between a blue that is going just a little bit purple now, and sort of the orange yellow tones in the image that appear on the pier itself. So I'm forcing those complementary colors rather than worrying too much about color accuracy. I'm now chasing complementary colors instead. Here is an image that I captured from Eureka Tower, one of the higher vantage points in Melbourne, looking out towards the bay where I live. And again, this is the as shot. And if I just show you, just by moving that temperature slider to the left, this time more than 2,500 degrees Kelvin lower, we get those beautiful complementary colors between the cool shadow tones and the warm tungsten lights of the cars driving home in the evening glow there. And this gives me the perfect color composition that I was chasing in this instance. So here is another auto white balance, and this time the auto white balance in camera has created quite a cool rendition in this instance. And again, I'm not so interested in color accuracy. I've just decided to use color as an emotive tool to express the drama of something going on, which is basically a storm front rolling in over my hometown, over the bay there. And so I'm not really worried about, is this accurate? I'm worried about how this feels, and I want to communicate that feeling to you as the viewer. Now, once when I was in Western Australia and I was editing my sand dune images, I looked over at another photographer editing his images, and he was making all of his sand dunes blue. I have to admit to raising an eyebrow, going, blue, interesting. But what I saw was, he was using the big rolling sand dunes as like waves of the ocean rolling around, albeit a lot slower than the waves in an ocean, and trying to communicate that peaceful scene and that cool serenity of this the rolling sand dunes, and also linking it maybe to the ocean as well. And so we can use color for very emotional creative responses here, rather than again representing reality. Color, we'll move on now not just to white balance but also two of the most important sliders, which are called vibrance and saturation. On the surface, these two sliders do a very similar thing, but they have different algorithms that are driving each of those sliders. Just to shortcut this, I'm just going to say that vibrance is used much more than saturation. Saturation tends to grab all colors, whether they're saturated or not, whether they're rich and vibrant already or not, and push that vibrance of all of the colors equally. There is no measured response depending on whether the color is already saturated or is quite a pastel tone. It just pushes them all equally. So what this can do in some instances is push colors that are already saturated, and it'll push them what's called out of gamut. It'll make them so saturated that we actually lose texture and detail inside of those color surfaces, so they start to look like extruded plastic. If, however, we move the vibrant slider recognizes colors that are already saturated and moves those at a slower amount to the colors that are less saturated. It also protects Caucasian skin tones from taking on this very unnatural orange glow. So it does protect a sense of reality when working with those. To get a good idea of how these sliders work, it is worth pushing them to their extremes to see what happens. For instance, if we grab that vibrant slider and push it all of the way to the left, we'll still end up with some colors that have a little bit of saturation. These are the colors that had most of the saturation when it started. So it almost fully desaturated the pastel colors and doesn't fully desaturated the saturated colors. So alternatively, if we pulled the saturation slider, it would pull all of the colors out equally from all of the colors, and you'd end up with a monochrome image. This is not the way, by the way, that you create black and white images with the greatest degree of control, but this is what happens when you drag the saturation slider all of the way to the left. Knowing how those sliders work and playing with them, you can actually learn that we can actually move both sliders maybe in different directions to get some special effects. For instance, in this image, I'm desaturating all of the pastel colors fully, but restoring all of the saturated colors fully. So I'm limiting the color palette and leaving only those colors that were saturated in the beginning. To show you a more subtle version of this playing out, here is a full color version of this image. I want it to be mostly monochrome but without going to black and white. So I've lowered the vibrant slider to make all of the colors of low saturation very mute, but restored some of the key colors at play in this image, which are those yellows on those bollards in the foreground. I've restored those fully just by raising the saturation, in this instance to +30. So now let's move on to color HSL, hue, saturation and luminance, sometimes referred to as the color mix inside of Lightroom CC. And here is the color mix. Now we have those rings of color on the top row there. Those are referred to as the hue. These are the names of color, like red is a hue, green is a hue, cyan, magenta, they're all hues. Now we can push a hue, so for instance we can push a blue to cyan, or push a yellow to orange. That is basically adjusting the hue. So that is the first thing to note. One of the things that when you're editing an image, you might come across a color which you find is maybe distracting. For instance, in this example, I find the purple and blues in Gilbert Namala's shirt here a little bit distracting to this portrait, which I want to be a little bit more monochromatic than it currently is. So what I've done is I've targeted the purples and dragged both the saturation and the luminance. The luminance is the brightness of the color, and drag that down so we end up with a monochrome shirt. I might also need to do the same thing with the blues in this image. Now, a word of warning here. As an illustrative photographer, editorial photography, I'm at liberty to do this and sell my images to magazines. But if you're a photojournalist and your images are considered as a document or a factual record of what happened in reality, you are prohibited from making these color adjustments. Ironically, you can actually create black and white images. You can strip all of the color away, but you can't modify individual colors. This is against the rules of photography for photojournalists who are there to try and tell some aspect of truth to their documentary photo essays or narratives. But for me, as an editorial photography, I may be looking at this meerkat and go, yeah, I know these meerkats come from Africa, and that green grass just looks typically out of place. It looks like it's a zoo image, which of course it is a zoo image, but I could pull your attention away from that background tone just by moving the hue maybe more towards the browns, desaturating those greens and making those greens darker. So now your attention is going to be fully focused on that meerkat and not drift to those very saturated greens in the background of this image. So this is a very useful editing tool to control the way our viewers see and use our images. Now, occasionally when you're editing an image, a color that you're editing might sit between two of those named colors. For instance, we've got greens and yellows, and that green grass I was editing had some aspect of yellow in that green grass and some aspect of green. So you can actually adjust both of these colors simultaneously using the target adjustment tool. Just tap on that target adjustment tool. The arrow is pointing to it in this slide. Then tap on the image, hold your finger on the image and drag up or down, and you'll see on the top row there the hue numbers will start to adjust. So it's an on image adjustment. You don't have to be moving the sliders. You can actually just tap and work directly on the image itself. Very good for people who are maybe slightly colorblind and not knowing which color it is that they're trying to edit. They can simply tap on it and adjust it darker, or give it more saturation, or change the nature of that hue. Okay, to give you an example, you can also do this with monochrome. This might seem a bit bizarre, adjusting color when there is no color, but that color also has a brightness value. So I've converted this image to black and white just by simply tapping black and white, or B and W, in that color panel, and then we have what's called a gray mix down below. So I can use the target adjustment tool, or if I know that typically skies are blue, I could just touch that blue pin and then drag the brightness of that sky much darker. So you can see we can have significant control over how we represent black and white by adjusting the brightness values of individual colors within our image. To give you another example, and it comes back to that green grass approach, again captured at the zoo, got this beautiful gorilla looking at me, eyeballing me, but the green grass again is very vivid. I know these gorillas do surround themselves with very abundant green foliage in the wilds of Africa, but I just want to draw your attention just to that gorilla stare there. So this is a creative approach at desaturating and pulling the luminance values down, and getting that gorilla stare now the feature and focus point of this image. Let's move our attention to a tool on the right hand side called Crop and Rotate. There's an arrow in the top right hand side there pointing to the crop rotate icon. And one of the things that we can do is, if we're unsure if the image is slightly crooked or not, we could just tap on that rule icon there for an auto straighten option. Now, a lot of photographers do shoot the vast majority of their images slightly crooked, and I have to say I fall into this camp. I've been capturing images for 40 years, and I am still struggling to photograph images that are not 1 degree crooked, or in this case 1.5 degrees crooked. So that little tap on that icon will typically 9 times out of 10 successfully straighten a slightly crooked image. Funnily enough, I do notice crooked images in post-production. I just don't notice them when I'm capturing them. One of the things that we have available to us in this crop panel is something called aspect. This is not linked to size, this is linked to shape. So, for instance, we often submit square images to Instagram. So if you wanted to crop your image to a square before uploading it, we could just tap the 1:1 square aspect ratio. Another thing that we might choose to do is we might be buying a photo frame from a shop, and that might have an aspect ratio that might be 5:7 or 5:4. That might be a specific shape. It might also be the inches of the frame as well, but it's also a shape. So we know we need to get all of the content into that particular shape before we send that off for printing. So this is a 5:4 aspect ratio, which is moving towards that square but not quite there. Now, one of the things that happens is, if you're chosen that 5:4 or 3:2 aspect ratio, you might decide, but no, this needs to be a vertical aspect ratio. So we can just click on that little rotate icon, and that will rotate the crop aspect. So we can go from a 5:4 horizontal, sometimes referred to as a landscape aspect ratio, into a vertical, sometimes referred to as a portrait aspect ratio. So these are ways we can control it. If at any time during the crop process you think you've made a mess of it, you can just double tap inside the crop marquee to start again, or tap that little reverse arrow on the bottom of this panel and to reset the crop. Remember, it is non-destructive. If you crop, you will never permanently throw away any pixels. This is a non-destructive editing program. Occasionally we don't want to edit to a specific shape. We can just unlock that little padlock and choose a custom crop. We can decide on the perfect shape depending on the content that is inside that crop marquee there. Now, one of the things that I will always do when cropping is I will move information that are on the edges of the frame that don't add to the composition. They're basically distracting for the viewer. So this is a beautiful blue ladder on a silo in New Zealand with a beautiful long shadow being cast, but we've got a little bit of sky on the right hand side of the frame, which is a definite distraction. So I've decided to crop it away so no one will ever feel compelled to go over there and check it out, because it doesn't add anything to the communication. This is a composition just about a ladder and its shadow, nothing more. To give you another example, this is a street image. I captured this on the run. I just noticed the smoke behind me, swung the camera around, captured the image. Didn't really have time to frame it properly in camera. We do, at the top of the frame, have lots of visual distractions, which I've decided just to crop away from view. So it's just the background, just these two guys, and just the steps and the smoke, nothing more. Nothing on the edges of the frame to pull the eye away from the communication that's happening towards the center. Another example, this time in a landscape setting. Here I'm setting the aspect ratio to 16:9, which is the same shape as our high definition widescreen TVs, and I'll often use this for horizontal landscape images. Now I've got three elements here. I've got the rocks, I've got the trees, and I've got a little bit of foreground water. For me, that's one element too much, so I've cropped away the foreground water. If I'd have caught a little bit of sky as well, I would have cropped that away as well. I often refer these landscape images as closed landscapes, where we don't have a sky appearing in them. Occasionally I want to crop a little bit tighter because I couldn't get any closer with my camera. I might have reached the minimum focusing distance of the lens, or the depth of field was getting too shallow if I moved too close to my subject matter. So I may be standing a little bit too far away from my subject matter, so I simply crop closer in post-production to get that hero image. One of the things that we can do, if you like to be guided by some more classical compositions such as rule of thirds, we can just touch and hold on the image preview in the crop panel to see an overlay of the rule of thirds. Generally I don't tend to do this a lot. I've got into the habit of not trying to center too much when I'm capturing images in camera, but it's remarkable how often a lot of my compositions do actually conform either to a compositional a rule called the golden ratio, or its simplified form called the rule of thirds. And so, for instance, this composition here is actually very, very close to being bang on the rule of thirds. One of the things that you can do is you can tap on the image view to go into full screen if you just need to be a little bit more precise as you compose this image. And I'm just fine-tuning that crop, so that rule of thirds basically runs down the center of this guy's face that I captured in Texas in the USA. And in this image, again captured slightly crooked, as you can see from the information behind, but also putting the horizon line on the upper portion of that rule of thirds overlay there. Don't use this rule of thirds as a straitjacket by any means, but for some people who are curious about where the rule of thirds sits in their image, it is a good little tool. I have to say the desktop versions, and certainly Lightroom Classic, has many more options for different overlays. The CC version currently only has the Lightroom, the rule of thirds overlay. Here it is being laid out over a portrait setting here, trying to get the eyes quite close to those intersection points of the rule of thirds. Again, here's breaking that rule of thirds law, because in this instance I decide I want to go for a symmetrical composition. I'll completely ignore the rule of thirds, and I'll actually raise that horizon line up a little bit more than you see in this illustration, because I want the vanishing point to be absolutely dead center in this image for a completely symmetrical image. Now, I said earlier about the 16:9 aspect ratio. If I do crop to a specific shape, 16:9 is my most used aspect ratio, and one of the reasons for this is TV screens and now most computer screens do conform to that shape. So if I want my images to completely fill somebody's screen with no letterboxing left or right or top or bottom, that 16:9 aspect ratio is going to do it a lot of the time. So it's the full screen TV aspect ratio. Now, as well as being a shape, it's also pixel dimensions. We often refer to these TVs as 4K TVs. 4K meaning close to 4,000 pixels on the width. It's not actually exactly 4,000 pixels, it's actually close. It's 3,840 pixels. The reason that it's not 4K, they just doubled the high definition, which was 1920 by 1080. Some of you will be familiar with that 1080 numerical figure. It used to be the height of high definition TVs, and that has now doubled to 2160 pixels, but most people are just referring to these TVs as 4K. Now, once we crop an image to and export an image from our full resolution image, we will find that generally most people using 24 megapixel sensors, we can crop quite aggressively in Lightroom without going under that 4K resolution. And because 4K resolution is close to 8.3 megapixels, so on most people can afford to crop away 2/3 of the pixels in their image and still have enough image resolution to look fabulous on a ultra high definition TV. You can check after a crop to see whether you've overcropped or whether you've still got some elbow room. Just go into the info, just tap the eye in the bottom right hand corner and just see the current pixel dimensions. For instance, this image has been cropped from 7,952 pixels right down to 3,840. This is the maximum I can crop this image before I go under 4K. Again, you don't use this as a straitjacket. If you do need to go under that dimension a little bit, nothing earth-shattering is going to happen, but what will eventually start happening is as you go down below 3,000 pixels, your images will start to appear a little bit softer on those 4K TVs. And the reason why you generally want to create some exports of your 4K files and have them available in a folder, I have mine available on the Flickr social media site, is because a TV that's running an Android operating system can link up to maybe your Flickr site and then start using your 4K images from your Flickr Folio album as a resource for your screensaver on your TV. And this is absolutely the best possible way to showcase your photography in your lounge room on your 65-inch TV and see them in 4K resolution. Most of your neighbors will be completely blown away by the quality of these images, because just remember, a lot of broadcast TV, you may have a 4K TV, but the information is being downloaded to that TV at standard definition most of the time. Okay, how much is enough? Certainly we've looked at 4K, the 3,840 pixels on the width there. Remember, some of the social media websites do not support these ultra high definition resolutions. Some of the numbers that I've just learnt are numbers like 2048. This used to be the old resolution of an older iPad. It's also the maximum resolution of Facebook. So you could poke a 40 megapixel file at Facebook, but it will downsample it to 2048. Other resolutions now, the iPad Pros and 4K tablets are going to start matching that 4K resolution. At the moment, some of the iPad Pros are sitting at resolutions higher than 2048, but have not yet hit 4K. Let's move over to another one of the panels, this time the effects panel. Perhaps the most used effect, or certainly one that I see being used most often, is the vignette slider. So I've bypassed some of the other sliders above vignette. Let's go into the effect that is used most often. I've often thought that half of all photographers will vignette at least half of their images. Now I'm just having a wild guess, but I do see a lot of photographers putting a subtle vignette on their image. A vignette is a way of darkening the corner corners of the image, and what this has an effect is drawing people into your subject, which is typically more towards the center. It stops the eyes drifting up towards the corners of the image, especially if those corners are a little bit bright. So it does have a very powerful effect on the way people view our images. Some people fall so much in love with a vignette they do apply too much, and certainly I do notice this on social media forums, is the vignette is very obvious. Now if you're looking at your images in the grid view, in the small thumbnails, you'll see the vignettes are very obvious on smaller scale images. So if you're looking at your grid view and you go, oh look, I can see my vignette, then there's a very good chance that I can actually see it on your much higher resolution image. So go over to your vignette slider, back away from the -60, come back closer to the -20, and I'll be less aware of that vignette. It still will have that effect that you're looking for, it'll just be less obvious. Another one of the most popular sliders in this effects panel is clarity. Now some subjects will take a lot of clarity before looking over processed. Here is a before and after of a cathedral shot. I think it's Worcester Cathedral in the UK, and I've ramped it up to +100, and I can sort of get away with it. The processed version is on the right side there. If you do this with a portrait, however, especially a young, say attractive woman, this +100 clarity is going to make that skin complexion look seriously unpleasant, and so you have to go very carefully with some images with clarity. Generally I'm in the +15, +20. Very rarely do I go much higher, so I've overcooked it in this instance just to show you the effect. Another way is people used to use negative clarity to maybe be more flattering to a model's skin texture, but it did give an unnatural appearance to skin. It looked post-processed. Lightroom has since come out with a much better slider for doing this, and it's called the texture slider. If you just drag the texture slider to the left rather than the clarity slider, you will get these much smoother skin complexions. What you may notice, however, is it's a global edit. It is not only doing it to the skin, it is also attacking some of the other smooth surfaces, such as the wall sitting behind this young woman in Kathmandu. So it's almost like the wall is getting a skin makeover as well as the skin. Now I will revisit this image just shortly to show how we can avoid this. So what we should notice, however, with this texture slider, it is protecting the sharp detail within the image, the eyelashes, the eyebrows, the jewelry, etc. If we're trying to add a lot of drama to an image, one that where the drama has been stolen away because we're either shooting underwater or we're shooting with a massive telephoto lens when there's a lot of ultraviolet light, or we're shooting out of an aircraft window, everything is very, very flat, and you can look at the histogram. There is very little shadow information or indeed highlight information. The histogram is sort of just sitting in the mid-tones, and so one of the best sliders when we're faced with an editing problem such as this, we could go and edit 10 sliders, but if you're not too sure which 10 sliders would correct this image, if you're just wanting to do it very quickly, my favorite slider for editing this very, very quickly is the dehaze slider. Just grab that and drag it to the right, and you're going to put a lot of drama. That histogram is going to reach out and touch the left and right sides. The contrast is going to be raised. The saturation will come back into the image. Now generally you'll be lucky if you get away with just raising the dehaze slider. You might have to go to the light panel and just fine-tune the whites and blacks, and you might have to go and revisit the saturation and white balance as well to get the perfect looking image. This is just looking through an aircraft window coming into just as we're flying into Seattle in the USA, looking at those volcanoes through the aircraft window there. Another slider which I don't tend to use a lot, possibly because I spent probably a decade and a half, maybe even 2 decades shooting on analog film, so I got a little bit bored with film grain, to be honest. But if you're having a nostalgic moment in your folio editing and you want to put or emulate or simulate film grain in your images, especially maybe with some of your black and white photographs, we do have a grain slider there, and we can also control the shape and size of that grain with the size and roughness sliders there, so we can make it look like it was shot with a 100 ISO film or a 400 ISO film, and so we can get that analog look without shooting film. Let's look at something called selective edits. Now these features are available for people who are basically members. They're paying their monthly subscriptions, and this unlocks these selective edits. And this is really where we can now start competing with the programs such as Lightroom Classic. I reckon we can do 90–95% of anything that we can now do in Lightroom Classic, and so I could quite happily edit all of my images to folio or professional standards without ever going into Lightroom Classic again. I still need Lightroom Classic at the moment, but I see a day coming where maybe I could just use Lightroom CC. So the little icon that you should draw your attention to is the little circle on the extreme right hand side with the little dots running around it. And once we click on that, we are given the choice of choosing an adjustment brush, a radial filter, or a linear filter. So let's start off with maybe adjustment brushes. But before we actually apply adjustment, we've got a little bit control over what sort of brush that we start painting an adjustment with. So if we click on that top icon in the tool, this controls the size of the brush. Now you need to slide your finger up or down to increase or decrease the size of the brush. Lightroom will show you an overlay to show you what that brush looks like, not where you're painting, but give you an idea of how big that brush now is if you start painting with that brush. The next brush or icon down is called feather. It's how it controls how sharp or soft the edge of that brush is. Now most of the time you do want to have the feather set very, very low, maybe minimum 0%, and that's because we do want 100% feather there. We want maximum feather, or we want maximum softness there. This is to disguise the fact, or hide the fact, that we're actually adding adjustments. If the brush has a hard edge, everybody's going to see our brush strokes where we've painted with more exposure or less exposure. We want the adjustments to fade in and out very gradually. The next icon down is called flow. This is usually kept very high, but for people who want to paint an adjustment with repeated strokes rather than with a single stroke, we can lower the flow so we can build up the adjustment by moving our finger or stylus over the same area multiple times. So I told you I'd revisit this image where we were running with a negative texture adjustment, and so if we didn't want that texture slider to attack the wall behind the woman, we could simply apply this adjustment as a brush. We just go and get a reasonably soft brush, a little bit smaller, and then just paint over the areas of the skin. If we tap the pin, we're going to get a mask overlay, so we can see where we've painted and where we still need to do a little bit more painting. So it's a question of painting, tapping the pin, painting a little bit more. We can, if we've painted over an area accidentally that we didn't want to paint to, we can move to the erase tool and start removing that adjustment. And I've got a slide that I'll showcase that coming up. One of the things that I will often do with a radial gradient, rather than taking the time to paint it manual, I'll just add a radial gradient with an extra 1/2 to 1 stop of light. It's almost like shining a soft beam of light over the thing that I think is most important. It does draw the viewer's attention to what I want them to look at. It's a bit like moths being drawn to the light. We are drawn to sharp, brighter areas of the image. So I'll just click and drag a radial over this woman's face just to add an extra 1/2 stop of light. Now this will flow over the edge of the face into the background. So what I'll do then is I'll just tap on that erase tool and then just paint that adjustment away from the background so it's only left on the face. So I could do this using a brush, but I just find it just a little bit faster just to drag a gradient and then remove aspects of that adjustment. Here I am adding a positive or plus texture. We could alternatively use plus clarity for this over this eye of the crocodile, just to really enhance the texture and detail going on inside of this fabulous eye of this crocodile. Let's move over to one of perhaps my most favorite selective adjustments, and this is the linear gradients. Showing you an image without the graduated or linear gradients present here. The sky, even though it's a very grey day in Melbourne here, it's about to rain, is still a bit bright and it's a little bit distracting. I want to lower the brightness of the sky to show everybody it is a grey day that was starting to look like it was about to rain. So I am going to select a linear gradient. I'm going to tap and drag my linear gradient down, and I'm going to move the light, the exposure slider, maybe -1, -1.5 stops to make the top of the image 1.5 stops darker than the bottom of the image. Now we have 3 lines associated to each linear gradient. We have the central portion there with the pin, which shows the actual position of the center of the graduated filter or linear gradient. We have the top, everything above that top line. The adjustment is being applied at 100%, and the adjustment doesn't venture below that bottom line. So no part of that bottom part or half of the image is being subjected to that adjustment. Beware of dragging these linear gradients that are too short. Again, like a hard brush stroke, people are going to be able to see the graduated filter. Now these graduated filters are actually used by some photographers in front of their camera lenses. It is very common for a lot of landscape photographers to darken the sky 1, 2 or 3 stops compared to the foreground, because this is a way of representing that landscape much closer to how humans remembered seeing the landscape rather than the cameras. The skies in high contrast situation always looked a little bit brighter than we remember them when we capture them with cameras. There is the extent of the full adjustment, and the bottom line shows where the adjustment ends completely. Now there is nothing limiting you to just one linear gradient. You can just simply tap on that little plus icon and add a second one if you need to fine-tune that sky. And you can also add graduated or linear gradients to other parts of the image. I often add a linear gradient to the bottom of the image. It almost adds like a bookend approach to the tonality, so the eye doesn't fall out of the bottom of the image because it's too bright. So we're stopping the eye wandering out the top of the image, and now I'm stopping people's eyes wandering out of the bottom of the image. So I've got 3 linear gradients in this particular edit. So there's a before and after. And what this is doing is it's focusing the viewer's attention on the guy pushing the pram and the bridge structure, and we just get a sense of the feeling of that grey sky, but we don't need to look at it. It's a little bit darker than the hero elements of this image. Now, a lot of photographers using graduated filters in front of their camera lenses, they only do one thing, and that is lower exposure. But in Lightroom, we're not restricted to adding one adjustment to any of our linear gradients. We can add 2, 3, 4, 5 adjustments to a single linear gradient. So here I'm starting off just by lowering the exposure at the top of the image by 1 stop, and then I'm going into the color panel and I'm grabbing that temperature slider and making it cooler. This is going to not only darken the top of the sky, but it's also going to cool that sky down. Now, the reason I'm doing this is it's a twilight shot, and I'm seeing that natural progression of warm orange tones through those cyan tones, through those darker blues. But because I'm shooting with a telephoto lens, we're not seeing the blues in the image I'm captured. I'm shooting below those cooler colors, so I'm pushing those cooler colors into the image so to make you aware of the color palette that I was viewing when I was photographing this Sydney skyline. And it's also giving me those complementary colors, which I often try to achieve when using a white balance slider such as the temperature slider. So it's achieving two things here. It's showing you the colors of the sky as I experienced them, but didn't quite fit into the frame of my composition, and I'm also creating those complementary colors. If you go onto my folio or some of my online folios, you will notice this is something that I do quite often because I am out and about at these twilight times of the day, and if I am shooting with not my wide angle lenses but my telephoto lenses, I can't communicate that graduated filter to you or those graduated colors that I'm experiencing, so I will push them in. Now in this instance they're coming in quite slowly compared to the previous image, so I'm having to be a lot more aggressive with that slider. So don't start looking at the numbers when you're pushing sliders. Don't go, oh, plus 20, that sounds like a lot, I think I should stop. Just look at the image when you're dragging that slider, and this will dictate whether you push that slider too far or not. Now there is a slight advantage, as I said, that we can do 90-95% of everything that we want to do in Classic. This is the desktop version of Lightroom CC, not even the Classic version, but we do have a couple of added features that haven't worked their way into the mobile version at the point of time where I'm making this movie. There's nothing to say it won't appear in future versions, and one of those features that we do have in the desktop version that we don't have in my mobile version at the moment is we can paint with a brush, or we can subtract from a linear gradient tool and have the brush notice there's an edge and work to that edge. I don't have to work very closely, which is very difficult when you're working with a finger on a tablet. This would encourage some people maybe to buy a stylus or pen so they can, and then pinch zoom out so they can work more accurately towards an edge. Or if you know this is proving a little bit difficult and you need a little bit more assistance, just put off this part of the edit until you get back home. The image will appear in your Lightroom catalog in the last edited version that you did on your tablet, and then you can just fine-tune that linear gradient in the desktop version. Let's move over to a panel called Detail. Typically there's a couple of things that we may want to do in the detail. There's a conservative amount of sharpening being applied to raw files in Lightroom CC. There are other applications that will sharpen a lot more than Lightroom CC. If you do like very sharp detail, you are going to want to raise that slider from its default of 40 and maybe double that slider somewhat. If you do that, I would encourage you to raise another slider there called the masking slider. This will limit the sharpening only to the high contrast edges of your subject, which will give that illusion of a very sharp file. What the masking slider does is it prevents sharpening the areas of continuous tone, and the problem with sharpening areas of continuous tone is if we have any noise in those areas, the noise will look sharper and more obvious. We can use a two-finger slide. We encountered this when we were looking for clipping of detail on the blacks, whites, highlights, shadows in the light panel. We also have this option working with the masking slider to put two fingers next to that slider and move forwards and backwards. And this will take the image into what's called threshold view. As you move that slider, anything that appears black is not being sharpened. Anything that remains white is being sharpened. One of the things that I can also mention is if you are having trouble moving these sliders accurately, is don't touch the pin itself. Just tap either side of the pin and the values of the adjustment will go up in small incremental values. If you're having trouble raising a slider by maybe 3 or 5, just tap to the right or left of the pin and you'll make those small incremental changes. Let's look at another one of the controls that we have in the detail panel, which is the control over the noise. Now, a lot of people often comment that when I'm posting images captured at a high ISO, their camera never looks as good at high ISO as my camera, and it's typically not the camera because we're using the same camera. It's how I've treated the post-production editing, in particular working sensitively with high ISO, a lot of noise in the images. So one of the things that I might do is in the detail panel I might raise the noise by 10 or 15. If you raise the detail slider, the noise slider too much to the right, you will lose fine detail. So detail in feathers, sharp detail will start to be raised from view. Yes, we can suppress all of the noise, but again our tones and surfaces will start looking like extruded plastic. So what I recommend doing is removing most of the noise with a selective adjustment. Basically use the adjustment brush or use a radial filter and apply the adjustment not to the middle of the filter as we were adding light to the woman's face previously. I'm adding the noise reduction to the outside of that filter. Now if you're not too sure whether the adjustment is being applied to the inside or outside, just tap that pin to see the overlay. A weird thing about the noise reduction slider I should point out here is moving noise higher is moving noise reduction higher. So noise will appear less as we raise the value higher. It seems a bit counterintuitive. I wish they'd have put the word reduction after noise so it'd seem a little bit more obvious why we're raising that slider higher and not lower. So here I am tapping the pin and it's showing the sharpness in this particular instance is being applied to the center, which is the wrong place here. As if we are doing any negative sharpness or negative noise reduction, we need to apply it on the outside of that. So here I am applying noise reduction to the outside. Let's just go back one slide. You'll see the little red arrow there points to the way we can invert whether the adjustment is being applied outside or inside of the radial filter there. The effect of doing this is a way of protecting the sharp detail on our subject. Noise is typically less obvious when we have lots of sharp detail on our subject. It's most obvious in the areas of continuous tone, such as the out of focus bokeh behind our subject. So this is typically where I'm applying the noise reduction. Here is an example of an image I captured at ISO 8000, and we're mostly aware of the noise behind the bird and not on the bird itself. So one of the things that I would also say is if you do like sharp images, you may want to just reduce the amount of sharpness and also mask the sharpness, just to make sure that you're not sharpening the noise aggressively before following up and going in with noise reduction. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is, if you are shooting at elevated or high ISO values in camera, is avoid underexposure. Underexposure in camera will tend to exaggerate the presence of noise as well. So here I am editing with the noise reduction and keeping the noise reduction away from the feather plumage of the bird, so we're getting maximum detail in the bird and minimum noise in the background behind the image. So for many people, if I put this image up on a 4K ultra high definition monitor, it looks like it was captured at ISO 400, not ISO 8000. So, and there is the processed image. If you're reviewing this movie on a 4K monitor, you'll probably nod your head and going, yes, that looks pretty good. I shouldn't be afraid of those high ISOs, especially on full frame cameras anymore. And here I am doing a noise reduction. I'm painting it in a few controlled areas now, and I'm working at 12,800 on a full frame Sony sensor here. Let's look at a healing brush. This is the little band-aid icon that we can see. If we are shooting landscapes at f16, we will notice if there is a little bit of dust on the sensor. If we just pinch and zoom or double tap to zoom in on that image, we may be aware that our sensor isn't as clean as it should be. And the way we get rid of that detail is to go into that healing brush and just choose an appropriate size, a size that is just bigger than the dust spot, and then tap to remove that. Now, some people will also want to use the spot removal for removing distracting elements, i.e. not dust spots at all. This is a bird in captivity at a raptor show in the UK, and it's got its little homing tag trailing behind it as it's flying. It's a little bit distracting, so I do feel like I just want to remove that from view, and the spot removal tool does allow me to do that. You can just tap and drag your finger over that line, and if Lightroom doesn't choose the perfect source to repair that, just drag that secondary pin, the grey pin, to a better position for a better heal around that area. Okay, another panel we can look at is a panel called Optics. If you're using maybe capturing with RAW files, maybe on kit lenses that are uncorrected, you may notice in post-production some barrel or pin cushion distortion. Basically verticals or lines that should be straight, there are bowing. This usually is most prevalent on cheaper quality of lenses, but we don't have to live with this. We can just come down to the Optics panel and we can look for that enable lens correction little switch there and switch that on. This does appear in the preferences. We can enable this by default so that we don't have to remember to do this, and this will now always correct any pin cushion or barrel distortions. There are a few exceptions. If the camera doesn't recognize the lens and Lightroom doesn't recognize the lens, it might not have enough information to be able to fully correct that. So you may have to start correcting that manually using the panel below called the geometry panel. So this is the distortions corrected. They're still leaning in because we're using an ultra wide angle lens and the camera is tilted up slightly, so we do have those converging verticals. And what I would do is go down into that geometry panel, click on the upright and choose auto, and now that will not only correct the distortions that the lens has provided but also correct the converging verticals, so they are fully corrected as well. Now there is occasionally an instance where the auto upright will get it wrong, in which case you just tap one undo And then you go to the sliders below, and you can start dragging those sliders. If you have any barrel distortion that wasn't corrected automatically, you'll use the top slider called the distortion, and this will try and counteract the effects of any barrel distortion that you might have going on in your lens. Here I am making those corrections manually, adjusting the vertical and also doing a small rotation. Now there is a little switch there which is highlighted blue called Constrain Crop. It is important just to enable that, otherwise you might get some white negative areas around where the corrections have taken place, which are not part of the image. It's basically just showing a blank canvas area because there are no image pixels in that area. By switching on the Constrain Crop, the image will automatically be zoomed a little bit so we don't see those negative areas anymore. There is another feature in the optics panel called chromatic aberration, or CA. We can have this corrected automatically. Again, if you're using a non-native lens, you might encounter an instance where it is not corrected. If you were to pinch zoom, look in the corners of your image, especially when using wide-angle lenses and you have some high contrast edges. If you see these color fringes going around the high contrast edges, usually complementary colors depending on what side of the edge we're working on, this is one form of chromatic aberration, and just by enabling that panel we can correct and remove that. There is a chromatic aberration that Lightroom CC on the mobile versions doesn't yet have the ability to remove. This is typically when we're using ultra wide aperture lenses such as f1.4, 1.8 lenses, capturing images at their widest apertures where we have very high contrast edges, typically against an area which has very bright exposure. We might get a color sitting on that edge that simply doesn't belong, like we have a purple edge sitting alongside the edge of this guy's hand in Japan. Now in the Lightroom desktop version, we do have the ability just to highlight that color and remove that chromatic aberration as well as the other chromatic aberration as well. But currently, as at the time of making this movie, this is not available to us on the mobile versions. This is the panel I use most often for correcting converging verticals. The process of correcting converging verticals is often referred to as keystoning, and keystoning will correct those verticals. Now you may have to do it manually in some instances, but it has quite a high success rate. You will need to constrain the crop to avoid having negative canvas area around those corrections, and you may also want to revisit the crop tool, because you may find that you want to make the crop marquee slightly smaller so we can reframe. We may have lost a little bit too much of the lower information in the auto keystoning, the auto upright, so we may want to just make the crop marquee slightly smaller just so we can push the crop marquee slightly lower. And again, I'm using that rule of thirds to put the horizon line on that lower line of that rule of thirds there. This is one image that doesn't get corrected by the auto. Some of the verticals in the center of this image are not actually vertical, so Lightroom gets very confused with what vertical it should be picking. There are two verticals which are vertical, but Lightroom doesn't know. It needs to be told which are the verticals. So I'm going into the guided transform. There's a little icon there you can just tap on with your finger, and then you can start dragging up to 4. You're going to need at least 2 of these lines that you need to drag in. This is basically telling a Lightroom, okay, I know these are horizontal, or I know these are vertical. Please snap the image and correct them around these known values. And so again, once you've corrected that, you can in this illustration see some of the negative canvas area coming into play there, because constrain crop hasn't yet been switched on. I've switched constrain crop on now. I've magnified the view just to get a more accurate positioning of these 4 guided lines. And then coming in again with the crop just to make sure that I get the perfect crop, because sometimes you may lose some of the image out of frame when you've done that correction. Let's take a look at some black and white conversions using Lightroom CC. First question I would often ask people is tell me a reason why you want to make a black and white image. Sometimes people will post on social media forums a color version and a black and white version and say, which one do you like best? Basically, they haven't done that little bit of preparation leading into why would you convert an image to black and white. So let's look at some instances why I would choose to make a black and white conversion. Most of the work that I do is color, but when I know I need a black and white, I am very clear on why black and white versions will look better to the color versions. So this first version is flat, midday lighting with uninspiring colors. It's a very dramatic scene, but the colors don't lend that sense of drama to the scene. Normally when I'm photographing landscapes, I'm working with the ambient light much lower, that creates those long shadows, better contrast, and this midday lighting isn't really conducive to creating dramatic landscape images. So in this instance I might simply drop to black and white and go for that Ansel Adams drama effect going on here, with very dark skies which will really highlight the clouds in those skies and get some very high contrast going on in these black and white conversions. This is an image I captured at a museum in the countryside in the state of Victoria, and I'm looking at the beautiful shadow coming off the tree going over this long wall receding into the distance. And I decide, although we got some complementary colours which I sort of like, I think it's taking the drama away from the light and shade, which should be the real heroes, not the blue sky and the orange wall. I think it should be the shadow of the tree that should be the hero element. So if I remove the color from the scene, we are going to feature on that big shadow. And when the guy came and looked at me taking the photograph, the guy who is walking into the shot now, he said, "What are you taking a photograph of?" And I said, "The shadow." He didn't actually notice the shadow until I mentioned that there was a shadow coming off the tree. And then he said, "Wow, now I can see it too." So if I'm communicating this via photography, I don't want to have that conversation with everyone. I just want them to immediately see the drama of the shadows. On a trip to Japan last year, I had the opportunity to photograph at a sumo stable. There was some interesting lighting, but the differences in color temperature between the fluorescent lighting inside and the cool daylight coming through the window just above these sumo wrestlers gave this blue-orange. Now normally I like complementary colors, but not in these mixed lighting situations. So the other thing I noticed is we're getting a lot of rim light on these sumo wrestlers, and so I was immediately aware that black and white versions of these sumo wrestlers would be much more dramatic. We're going to notice the sweat glistening on the bodies of these wrestlers much more readily than once we've removed the color from the scene. So I see this as immediately as a problem solved. So rather than changing one of the images in the series to black and white, I changed the entire series of images. So the entire documentary or series of sumo wrestlers were all in black and white, and there's a final edited version there. Another reason you may want to convert to black and white is typically we have a sense of history, as obviously black and white precedes color film. And so if we're looking at photo documentaries, maybe from our grandparents' time, we're used to seeing images as black and whites from that era. So when I was in Hiroshima in Japan, and I was looking at the hypocenter of the first atomic bomb explosion, I was quite clear that this series of images would look better in black and white. One, because we can see the drama of the light and the shade of this medical practitioner coming onto the hospital wall there, which is the hypocenter. But it also has a connection with the photographs that we saw immediately after, when people visited Hiroshima after the atomic bomb and started taking those photographs. So it connects this body of work taken in the present day with the previous body of work taken in 1945. Okay, I always think that black and whites should be more than just a single click preset. We do have some profiles, and you might create a black and white preset, but I always think a black and white conversion is a little bit like storytelling. The software will never know what you think is the hero element in the shot, and this is important. When Ansel Adams was in his darkroom, he used a technique called dodging and burning, either adding more light or adding more depth to the shadows to showcase information or suppress information. And this is our storytelling narrative. What do we want people to look at? What do we want to shine more light on? What do we want people to ignore? And we can control that by making certain subjects lighter and certain subjects darker. So this is my black and white conversion. Ansel Adams was often made his skies very dark simply because he didn't really want you to look at the sky itself. Maybe the clouds in the sky, maybe the mountains near the sky, but typically never the blue sky itself. So what I'm doing is I'm drawing your attention to those abandoned huts in California on the dry side of the Sierra Nevada, near Mono Lake in this instance. So the first step might simply just be to go to the color panel and tap the black and white option, so it immediately goes from color to black and white. We then have the option of creating a gray mix. We can make some colors lighter and some colors darker, and you don't even need to remember what colors are what. You can just say, oh, I like the foreground, maybe there should be more light in the foreground, or maybe the foreground should be darker, maybe the sky needs to be a little bit darker, and you can basically use that target adjustment tool or selective adjustment, and then just touch and drag on the image itself to make certain tones darker or lighter. This will not get you all of the way, in my opinion, to the perfect black and white conversion. You will want to follow up with some dodging and burning, some linear filters, maybe some radial filters. So I'm adding a linear graduated filter to the top. In fact, I've added 3. I've also added 1 to the foreground there to build up and control exactly the fall off from those top bright clouds up to the very dark sky at the top of the image. I'll then follow up with some painted adjustments using the adjustment brush, adding a little bit more light to the huts and the distant mountains there. I might also make sure that if I am painting a little bit clumsily, I then go and subtract any of the halos from where I've accidentally painted an adjustment that I don't need to be in that area. You may also, if you don't have a stylus or a pen to work with your tablet, you might want to just tap the image, so you zoom the image so you can work much closer to the edge than zoomed out when working with the panels open. You'll also want to maybe change the nature of what the adjustment is doing. For instance, I've moved from a tonal adjustment now to a clarity adjustment, and the clarity adjustment is because those distant mountains, the Sierra Nevadas, they're a little bit flat in contrast because of the extra ultraviolet light in the distance there. So what we're doing is we're just building up the depth of those distant mountains so they don't look quite so flat. So I do have a tutorial on my website. It does use the Lightroom Classic version, but all of the tools you have access to, you pretty much have access to on the mobile version. So you can download this image as well and try working up this image and try and get to the endpoint that I am using as an example here. The other thing I should mention about black and white conversions is don't forget the profiles as well. The profiles is an excellent starting point before we even can look at color mixes or tonal mixes for black and white. We should look at those black and white profiles as well. I've got a couple of these saved as favorites for me, and here I'm using the black and white 3 filter, and this is will get me half of the way there before I add the linear graduated filters, etc. So, and I'll just showcase some of the beautiful black and white conversions that I've been doing in Lightroom, both the classic version but also the CC versions as well, and certainly showing why I might decide to work with black and white in these instances, because for me these sand dunes is all a story about light and shade, not so much about the blue sky or even the pale orange sand itself. It's just about where the light is falling and not falling. So let's move over to another associated topic called toning. Sometimes we can not only choose white balance, but we can choose to selectively move colors within an image for creative control or communication of narrative story. So I'll just show you a couple of examples. Here's a full color version. We're actually in a park here, and it's a sunlit day. There's a lot of very bright green tones surrounding my sitter in this photograph, and some of those green tones are populating the dark shadow tones of my sitter sitting in the shadows. So one of the things that I'm going to do is move the vibrance down to get rid of some of those subtle colors, and then I can control the overall color of the image using the temperature slider. It's a little bit like creating a sepia tone effect without going fully monochromatic here. So I'm using what we've learned about the vibrance slider, and then swinging the color temperature from cool to warm just for that little bit of effect. You can see it's not fully sepia because the lips, which had a little bit of saturation, still have a little bit of their natural color. They're not going that brown color. They're still held on to a little bit of their cherry color there. And what I've done is I've just worked this image a little bit more and just done a selective adjustment on the eyes with the color temperature set to very cool, just to enhance the blue eyes to bounce off the warmer brown tones in this image. And I've just raised some of the natural color on the lips there just to finish this image. And this whole image edit again probably took place in no more than a minute. And another example, going a little bit more green on the eyes now, and just a little bit more warmth in those lips. Another toning effect that we have, now I would have placed it in the color panel, but Adobe have chosen to put it in the effects panel. I suppose it is an effect, but it is a color toning effect, so I generally would have put it in the color panel by choice. This is split toning. It's where we can choose to use one color that will populate the highlights, and usually a complementary color to populate the shadows within the image. And here I am choosing one color for the highlights, a warm color, a cooler color for the shadows, and then I'll come in with the final slider, which is the balance slider, to basically choose the axis of the seesaw, if you like, between shadows and highlights. I decided I wanted more of the tones to be highlights, i.e. populated by those warm tones, so I just moved the balance slider to the right there. Here I am using split toning, not to create accurate color, but again to create some creative or emotive uses of color. and I'm split toning a full color image in this instance. So that yellow line running along the pier here in the rain does have a natural yellow tone. So we're not completely stripping away some of the natural color. I'm just using chosen colors to populate the highlights and shadows either side of the mid-tones there. So there is a before and after, a much more subtle version of split toning here. Another example, this is the full color version. I'm going into the effects panel, choosing split toning, choosing a warmer color for my highlights. That will typically include some of the skin tones in your image as well, and then choosing a complementary color for the shadows. Again, usually cool tones. So let's look at one of the things that you might want to do when you've edited a body of work. Of course, you'll want to share them. You'll want other people to see the work that you've not only been capturing, but you've been editing quite carefully. The idea is you want to communicate certain things, so we must get those images out there. So one of the things you may notice, already have noticed, is there's a little icon with an up arrow, and this is the share icon, and if you tap on it you will see your Facebook and Instagram icons there, and I'm going to ask you not to do this. Not because I've got anything against Facebook or Instagram, but this workflow will export an image of very low quality to Facebook. It will export one only 960 pixels with quite a lot of image compression. It is not going to showcase how good your camera is or the quality of your editing. So there is another way to get a much better quality image to social media than this workflow here. And that workflow is to export the image from one of those lower options there. Export to your camera roll, export to your files on your tablet, or take complete control over how big or the quality of that export by clicking that lower icon there. So once you've exported that, and it might be to your camera roll or your folder, just open up Facebook on your mobile device, click on photo, and then find the photo that you've exported from starting with Facebook first, not starting with Lightroom. Don't go from Lightroom to Facebook. Go to Facebook, click on photo, then find the photo that the high quality photo that you've exported. So in this instance I've gone to camera roll. I've picked up my picture of my duck. I'm now uploading that, and you'll see that this is more than double the resolution of the default workflow there. So we're going to get an image that is the maximum quality that Facebook supports, 2048. This is going to look fabulous on a tablet, and we can now export that, and I can say something about my beautiful duck before I post here. Another way of exporting and sharing perhaps a body of work is to create an album of images that you've been capturing. You can just go to your grid view, look for the plus icon. You can select image using the organization menu items. You can decide which images go over to this new album. Once you've got the album sorted with 6, 10, 60 images that you want to share, you will now click on those 3 horizontal dots next to your album. The album by default will be private, no one can see what's inside your album, but you'll want to enable sharing. And once you've enabled sharing, you're going to go over to a couple of the options such as link settings. I like people to see the camera settings I've been using when I've been capturing my images, my aperture, my shutter speed, my ISO. So I'm going to enable show metadata. I'm going to hide the location info if I've been using maybe a a mobile device such as a smartphone. I don't want people to know where I am, maybe, or where this person is that I've been photographing, so I will hide the show location info. I will allow comments and likes, and if I want people to be able to download them so they can download my files to their devices, I'll also enable allow JPEG downloads. I will be given a link, and then I can share that link. And the beautiful thing about the links I'm now sharing with my friends and my family is they can view this in any web browser on a mobile device or a desktop computer. They will get a grid view of the images in the album. They can tap on any image or click if they're on a desktop computer, and this will go into very high resolution, much higher than social media platforms like Facebook supports. So this is really going to showcase the quality of my imagery. And if you've enabled comments, you'll be able to see the comments on or in Lightroom on your mobile device if anybody makes a comment. I think you need a Lightroom Creative account to actually make those comments. Sometimes you'll be wanting to export a file, not for social media, but you want to put on an external drive and then maybe transfer over to your TV or computer or give to a friend. And for me, the starting point for files that I want to share are ones that showcase the quality of my work. So the starting point for me would be that bottom option, export, where I can control exactly the size of the export, and I'll choose Longside 3840, which is the 4K dimensions, and then I can choose to export. Typically I'll choose a JPEG quality of 90%, and most people will never see the difference between 90 and 100, but a 90% quality will have a file size typically half that of 100%, but have all of the quality that will appear on a TV or whatever. Let's move to a section of this where we're moving slightly beyond what Lightroom. It's a way of showcasing maybe some of the limitations of Lightroom CC that you may or may not be aware of. It's also showcasing that there are apps coming to tablets which we typically would have required a desktop computer to do this level of sophisticated editing. And one of the things that we cannot do on the mobile devices that we can do on the desktop version of Lightroom CC is merging bracketed shots. It's called HDR merge. So if you couldn't get all of the tonality because it was such a high contrast scene, this is the transformer buildings in Hong Kong, I've actually merged 5 separate exposures and then edited into one final exposure. This is possible in the Lightroom on your laptop computer or desktop computer, not the classic version, just the CC version, and we can do that there. And if we do that, the image will be transferred back to our mobile versions as well. The other thing we can do is another merging, which is the panoramic merging. So we wanted to create a panorama, but our wide angle lens wasn't quite wide enough. We can do a panoramic merge in the desktop version as well. Okay, moving beyond the desktop version now is we're going into another Adobe app which has made an appearance onto iPads in 2019, which is Photoshop for iPad. We have seen trimmed down versions before, but nothing quite so fully featured. And no, it's not as fully featured as the desktop version, but it does allow us to do quite a lot of sophisticated editing, which is above and beyond what we can do in Lightroom CC. So I'll just quickly showcase some of those things now. For instance, this is the Tora gates from Japan. We've got a little bit of a white line running between two of the upright orange poles there. Now we can attempt to clone or heal that out in Lightroom. It is a little bit of a fiddly job. It's much easier just to go and open in Photoshop on an iPad, and with the stylus or my finger just drag over the offending area, and Photoshop is likely to make a faster and better job of that than Lightroom itself. So Photoshop just tends to do a better job. And once we've done it in Photoshop, I'll just export it back to Lightroom, so the edited version sits alongside the original version in my Lightroom catalog. To give you an example of really where Photoshop draws on its strength as a multi-layered editing program, is we can start taking elements from multiple files and spitting them out as one single file. This is two images that my wife captured. One image has the dog looking at the camera, but the boy is blinking, so has his eyes closed. And on the other image, the boy has his eyes open, but the dog is looking away. Now, this is just a 1-minute edit inside of Photoshop to make sure that we get the best of both worlds. We take the eyes of the boy wide open, the dog looking at the camera, and it becomes the perfect moment, even though each image was captured a fraction of a second apart. Another example, and again this is just a 1-minute edit. I'm only actually going to show you some 1 and 2-minute edits here. I've taken 2 pictures of a house I used to own. One image is with just twilight. The second image is with the lights on at night time. I put the nighttime scene as a layer above the twilight scene, and I've just changed the blend mode of that layer to lighten. That's the only thing I actually did. Just change the blend mode, just a single option, and that switched the lights on inside of the house in one single image. You may have seen this done in real estate photography 1,000 times before. This one, I actually captured this image looking back towards Melbourne before sunrise, but I decided I would add a sun in post-production and also create the reflection in the water. So I just used a stock image of a starburst and added that on a layer. And in order to get the reflection, I had to duplicate that, flip it, so that the sun was in place on the water. And again, that was just a 1-minute edit. In this particular image, I've added a creative border, I've added a little bit of lens flare, I've added a little bit of texture, all just dragging in separate images and putting them on layers, and then just doing a little bit of basic masking and using a few basic blend modes. In this image, this is a stock image of a man smoking a pipe. I've grabbed another stock image of just the smoke, switched the blend mode to screen, and now the smoke is coming out of the pipe. And I've just got a little bit of a few options there for transform, so I can move that smoke into just the right place. This is one of my own images, which is the perfect composite. I've got the perfect wave smashing into the rock, and another one where I've got the perfect stormy sky, and I just add the waves from one file into another file. And as they were probably taken no more than 30 seconds apart, but I've got a more accurate representation of what I experienced over a several-minute period rather than a split second. This is a little bit more of a creative edit here. I'm using a little bit of flare, stock image of some snowflakes falling. Again, just a 1-minute edit, just to take a very cold, sterile looking studio portrait and giving it sort of a winter dramatic feel by adding a few layers. And as again, if every time I've edited one of these, I'll either export it or quick export so it goes back and appears in my Lightroom catalog. Okay, so there is a before and after of that edit. One I did last year recently in Japan was a 2-layer edit. The model is the same model. I just got her to collapse the umbrella and move over to the right side, and asked her, now pretend you're presenting the umbrella to yourself. I did a very simple graduated mask, so it hid the top half of one file and revealed the layer of underneath, and I was able to duplicate the model, and that took about 10 seconds. This one took a little bit longer because I'm introducing different elements into the photograph, but same model, and it's gone into the background there. This is often referred to as a fixed Position Composite. I've got tutorial of these using the full version of Photoshop, but I'm happy to say now these are more than manageable just on the iPad app. And again, I've got a tutorial of this one on my website, a free tutorial, and again just using a stock texture, one of my own borders, trees inverted so they're upside down, and a profile shadow of my daughter's face there, and creating an interesting double exposure. You may have seen these done in camera occasionally, this one now done in post-production. And there's a creative illustration, repeating the same image multiple times, getting a little bit of a multiplicity effect going on there, adding some texture, adding a little bit of split toning, and we're getting that final outcome. Okay, so this is basically concluding the tutorial now. There is an ebook you can download with the slide deck that I've been using, so you can walk your way through this. And this slide deck will include these following slides, which you may want to study at a little bit more length than I've got time to go into here. This is a key of what all of the icons are doing in the edit. When you're editing your images, I think we've covered pretty much most of them, so you won't be at a loss of what most of them do. You might find one or two that I haven't covered in any detail there. We have some gesture shortcuts. These are how you can use one or more image by tapping or sliding, and what they do when you tap the image as opposed to what you do when you tap the sliders. And if you've attached a keyboard to your tablet, there are a few keys that also will have an influence what happens when you're working on a tablet. Generally they're working with the way you rate, flag, reject images, and so we don't have to go in and do that as a separate task. We can simply edit an image, tap the number 5, and it becomes a 5-star hero image without going into the rating module of Lightroom on a tablet. Okay, so obviously this was quite a lot of work for me to generate, and I am giving all of this information away as a free download. And remember, there's an ebook you can download. If you found this very useful and you want to support future content creation, this probably took me 2 weeks to create, think about buying me a coffee or shouting me a coffee, as they say in Australia, and just make a small donation via PayPal. There will be a link in the info section below the movie. On this page in the ebook, you can just click or tap, and this will take you to a PayPal donation link, and just donate as much as you feel you got value from this product. If you're wanting to have ongoing conversations, it is very difficult answering every question via social media now. Some people will fire questions at me via Messenger or email, but with 95,000 followers just on YouTube alone, I have had to switch notifications off. I do offer a service though for people who want to have me as an ongoing mentor and tutor, where they can ask a question any day of the week, and I also as well as answering those questions, I will also give a 1-hour seminar to those patrons. Just head over to patreon.com, look for Mark Gaylor, obviously that's me, and just consider either one of those 3 tiered levels. If you just want to message me, it's just $2 per month. If you want to access free ebooks and seminars, Q&A forums, then you'll move up to that $5. If you want limitless photo critiquing, then you'll move up to that $10 level there. Okay, and that concludes the editing images in Lightroom CC. Just remember, there is a classic version of this tutorial as well. I'm Mark Gaylor. Good to have you along for that very long ride looking through Lightroom CC. Cheers, and I'll catch you online. Just give me a thumbs up if you found this useful. Thank you.